Terrific. Okay. Well, we're going to be, this next hour, zipping through an awful lot of material. I see some of you have notes with pens. Just put them down. You can get the PowerPoint from me afterwards. Just come up and see me. Have a USB drive. I'll slap it over to you. I have about 100 slides I've got to get through. And what we're going to do today, I'm not going to talk so much about the Quran. That'll be tomorrow. We're going to look at how the Quran was put together and what we now know about the earliest manuscripts. Some of you were probably here yesterday when we did the debate on the Quran with Dr. Edip Yutzkel. We pretty well destroyed the Quran yesterday. Today we're going to destroy Muhammad and how Islam began. And I say that without any apologies, because I certainly say that at Speaker's Corner. I do this in London, and the Muslims need to hear that we are now finding out an entirely different message concerning Islam from what they've been telling us for the last, not 1,400 years, but 1,300 years. Now, what do Muslims claim? Well, they claim that Muhammad is the last and greatest prophet. They claim that the Quran was his final revelation. Therefore, Islam is the final religion. It's the greatest of all, certainly the Abrahamic religions, and it's the final one of those three. Everything Muslims are dependent on are two things. They're dependent on the book and the man, the book and the man, the book and the man. The book is the Quran, the man is Muhammad. Without Muhammad, without the Quran, Islam falls. And that's why we're spending so much of our energies zeroing in on the book and the man. The same paradigm fits for us. We are also dependent on another book and another man. The book called the Bible, the man Jesus Christ. A bigger book, a bigger man. So that's why, since we start from the same paradigm, we probably understand them better than anybody else. That's why it's important that we engage in this debate. The secular world, the humanists, the atheists, they don't understand what we're talking about. They don't understand the power of one book and one man, like Muslims and Christians and Jews can. So that's why in some ways what we're going to introduce today and tomorrow is we should be at the forefront of this discussion. And that's why I want to introduce these two different themes these 2 days. Let's start then with Muhammad. What do we know about him? Well, according to the classical account, and this is what you have been taught, this is what's taught in all our schools, this is what's taught in our seminars, our Bible schools, well, this is what's been taught everywhere. That Muhammad was born in 570. He started receiving his revelations in the cave, the Hira cave, in 610. From 610 to 622, the next 12 years, he received what we know as the Meccan surahs, which are the latter part of the Quran, from around Surah 20 on to the 114. And then in 621, he is woken up in the middle of the night, told to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak. He flies up to Jerusalem, and he goes up to the seven heavens, meets God, or Allah, who tells him to pray 50 times a day. Comes down 2 heavens, meets Moses, who asks him how many times, and he says 50. He says, that's way too many. See if you can get it back down. So he jumps back up to the 7th heaven, and he bounces back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven, bringing the number of prayers from 50 to 45 to 40, down, right on down to 5. When he gets to 5 prayers, Moses says, that's fine, go on back down. And so he does, comes to Jerusalem and flies back down to to Mecca. Now, that's in 621. That's known as the Mi'raj. The Mi'raj. And of course, the next year, 622, he then moves from Mecca up to Medina with maybe 80 to 200 followers. It depends on which tradition you're going to follow. And then from 622 to 632, that last 10 years, he receives the Medinan revelations, and that's the much larger part it's half the Quran. Nonetheless, it has the largest surahs. And then in 630, he goes down to Mecca, defeats it without firing a shot, and he dies in 632. 2 years, next 2 years, Abu Bakr takes over. He dies peacefully. Then he is followed by Umar till 644. He is killed. Uthman takes over from 644 to 656. He is killed, and then Ali takes over from 656 to 61, and he is killed. Now, that's known as the 4 rightly guided caliphs, from 632 to 661. That's known as the Rashidun period. That's the golden period of Islam. That's what ISIS and all the other groups want to take us back to, that golden period. Actually, it starts from 624 to 661, so roughly 40 years. That's the golden period. Now, have any of you heard any other story than what I've just said? No hands are raised. There's no reason to hear any other story. This is the only story we have ever heard for the last, you'd like to say 1,400 years. It's not 1,400 years. Everything I have just talked about is right there in that red area right there. So basically from 570 to 661. But where do we get this information from? Where does any of this come from? Were they written down by people who knew Muhammad, who were actually there, who were eyewitness to what he said and did? No, none at all. Everything we know, everything I've just been telling you, all the stories and all this skeletal reference to Muhammad's life was first written down by a man named Ibn Ishaq. Well, that's 765. That's the late 8th century. We don't have any of his material. We're therefore dependent on another man named Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham was writing this down around 833. So that's 200 years after Muhammad died. We have really nothing earlier than Ibn Hisham in written form today about what Muhammad did. That's the Siratu Rasulullah. That would be the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. His sayings come quite a bit later. They are first written down and compiled in their final form by a man named Al-Bukhari. He dies in 870. You can see, therefore, this red area here. There you can see Ibn Hisham. That's 240 years after the Prophet died. When you get to the tafsir and the tahqiq, which would be the commentaries on the Quran, and the tahqiq would be the histories of mankind, when you get to that genre of material, they're first tabulated by a man named Al-Tabari, who died in 923. So everything we know that happens in this part of the world, of this time period, from the 7th century, is not written down till the 9th and 10th century. Does that bother any of you? It should bother all of you. We have to wait 200 to 300 years to hear about this man, that place, the book, and this religion. 200 years of what? Well, so-and-so got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so. These are called isnad. Isnads are nothing more than a chain of names that are relating oral tradition. All based on oral tradition. 200 years of oral tradition. And for what reason? Let's look at Jesus. We know quite a bit about Jesus. Another historical figure. We know that the people that were there, actually, we know quite a bit about his life. We have 3 biographies of his life that were written before 60 A.D. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew was actually an eyewitness to what he was writing. Mark and Luke got it from the eyewitnesses. John would have been written much later, about 90 A.D. But certainly within 60 years, you have 4 witnesses of Jesus' sirah, what he did, and 4 witnesses of Jesus' hadith, what he said, the red letter part of the gospel account. All written within 60 years, 2 by eyewitnesses and 2 by those who knew the eyewitnesses. We have Paul's letter, which were starting to be written down within 15 years of Christ's death. So you have the tafsir. Paul's letters would be the tafsir. That would be the equivalent, the commentaries of what Jesus said and did, how he applied it to there in Philippi, in Ephesus, in Galatia. The histories would be the book of Acts. The book of Acts would have been written between 52 and 62 AD. That's within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death. So you have the seerah, you have the hadith of Jesus, you have the tafsir of Jesus, and you have the tahqiq of Jesus. All 4 genera of what we know as their Islamic tradition. We have the traditions of Jesus written down within 40 to 60 years of Christ's death. Now you do a comparison, and you can see which is better. I'd rather go with 50 to 60 years of Christ's death rather than 200 to 300 years of Muhammad's death. If we were dependent on Jesus Christ, what the Muslims are dependent on, that means we know nothing about Jesus Christ until the 3rd century. And we could not prove his historicity. Can you see what Muslims are up against? And why is it we haven't asked this question before? So the 21st century historical scholars are now asking this question. This is what they're saying. Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. The conclusion is that the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, 685 to 705, that's his dates, and before, is a later fabrication. Now that's a big thing to say. Let's now prove it, and let's see what they're doing. And this is why they're asking this question. If so much of the history of Islam is written down so late, why did it take so long to write it down? Could these people read and write? Were they not literate? Absolutely. We know that by 642, the Arab world had moved, and these Arabs, I'm not going to call them Muslims yet, you'll see why, these Arabs had taken over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, the 5 great cities of the Levant. So within 10 years of Muhammad's death, they already controlled those 5 cities. By the time Abd al-Malik comes to power in 685, they had swept right across North Africa, all the way to Spain in the west, to India in the east, was all under their control. Are you telling me that no one could read and write between Spain and India? Are you saying that there were no literate people in Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, or Cairo? Was there not a library that was burnt in the 5th century in Alexandria? What are you burning if you're not burning books? What is a library for if it's not books? More than that, it's very clear in Sahih Bukhari, volume 6, 510 and 509, 510, it's very clear that the Quran was written down at the time of Abu Bakr, 2 years after Muhammad's death, between 632 and 634, the first recension. What did they write down? Zayd ibn Thabit is the one credited with that. He was the secretary of Muhammad. How could you be a secretary if you can't read and write? Obviously they could read and write. So why did they not write anything down about this greatest prophet in the history of mankind, this greatest religion in the history of mankind? And what about the Quran? Where is it? We'll get on that tomorrow. What about the biographers? Where did these 9th century biographers get their material from? Sahih Bukhari is related that he was given 600,000 of these akhbars. And of the 600,000, he was to whittle them down and bring them down to only those that were authentic. And so he did that, whittled them down, and brought it down to 7,397. That means he threw out 98% and only retained 2%. Why? Where did he get the other 98% from? And what happened to that 98%? Wouldn't you like to read it? I'd like to read it. I'd like to know what he'd thrown out. Well, that's exactly why the historians are asking this question. Therefore, they're saying, should we trust this material from the 9th and 10th century? And shouldn't we rather go back to the 7th century and find what actually happened? So let's see what they're finding. Now remember, let's look at a map here so you see what I'm talking about. You can see here's where Islam was up to, the brown area, up until 661. Then it moved right across over up to Andalusia, which is Spain today, and India over here, the Mughal Empire, further that came later on. But that's where they had already controlled by the end of the 7th century, the end of the 7th century by the time of Abd al-Malik, just to get that picture. Now the material that I'm going to be using comes from some of the best, finest scholars in the world today. Men like Dr. John Wansborough, head of School of Oriental African Studies. He was the one that wrote the 2 books that blew this whole question open in the 1970s called Quranic Studies and Sector and Milieu. Dr. Joran Hotting, who was my professor in 1994. When I first came across it, I did my first debate on this in 1995. We're talking about 21 years ago. I did my debate on this with Dr. Jamal Badawi at Cambridge University, and I used Hotting's material along with Dr. Patricia Corona out of Denmark. In fact, she was my supervisor at that time. I was with her the night before at Cambridge University, and she gave me 10 historical challenges. Those 10 historical challenges are still up on the internet. They're on our debate site. They have yet to be answered, and that was 21 years ago. So that was in 1995 that we started asking these questions publicly. 1995, Dr. Patricia Corona was probably the most devastating woman to go to because this woman reads and writes 15 languages, all archaic languages. How many of you can read and write 15 archaic languages? That's why she's so difficult to confront, because she reads everything in their original language. And a lot of times she does not translate it for our benefit because she does not want Muslims to read what she's translating. She has now deceased as of last year, unfortunately. Dr. Andrew Rippon out of Calgary has probably taken this material and put it into the easiest form, the easiest book to read on it. Dr. Robert Hoyland, another one of our supervisors when he was at Oxford University, at that time he could read and write 18 languages. These people are linguists of the first order, and that's why they're so devastating to be able to confront. Dr. Yehuda Nevo out of Jerusalem, who has done the best work on the early inscriptions from the Negev Desert, of the earliest Arab inscriptions. And in the German school, Dr. Gunther Lulling, who has written about the best material on the Syriac writings. Dr. Gerhard Prin, Dr. von Bothmer, Dr. Oleg, who are the ones who have taken and done the best work on the earliest manuscripts. Some of their material I'll introduce tomorrow. So we have all of these people are coming out of Europe. They're not from America. These are Europeans, and they're way ahead of us in Europe on this. This is why it's so good to be in Europe, to get their material firsthand, and to be able to work with them, and to talk to them face to face, and to see where they're going with this. And it's going to learn, then there's 2 books that have come out. One was, did I go past that slide? No. 2 new books have come out and 1 documentary, one by Dr. Tom Holland. Dr. Tom Holland wrote this book in 2012. He took 6 years to write it, going back to all the scholars that I just mentioned in the slide before, and he took the material and tried to put it down into layman's terminology so you and I can understand it. And that's the book came out in 2012 that asked these very historical questions. He then put it into a documentary, just an hour-and-a-half documentary, which you cannot see here in the United States. We can see it in Europe still, but you're not permitted here. And it's interesting because that documentary was shown on Channel 4 television in England on August 28, 2012. It caused such a furore amongst the Muslim community that when they wanted to show it again in November of that year, they could not because of all the Muslims that confronted it. And all he did was to take the conclusions. Well, no, he didn't even do that. He just took the assumptions from the book. He didn't come to any conclusions. He let the viewers come to their own conclusions. If any of you want that video, I have it on my computer. I can give that to you also afterwards if you have a USB drive. But then another book came out in 2012. Dan Gibson is a friend of some of you here. Some of you know who he is. Dan Gibson is a Canadian. His father was an archaeologist. He's been an archaeologist. For 30 years, he's worked in the Muslim world. He lives there amongst them, learned the languages, and he was the one that has probably done the most devastating work of actually asking the pertinent questions concerning the geography of Islam and also the problem with Mecca and the Qibla. There has been a brand new documentary that's just come out called The Sacred City. I think there's a leaflet going on. If any of you do have a chance, get the documentary. It only costs $15. It just came out a month ago. And some of the material that I'm going to be introducing this afternoon comes from that documentary, put out and done by Dan Gibson. And it's this material that the Muslims are going to have to contend with, because we introduced this back in 1994. I introduced it in 1995 in my debate. This is now 2016, and no Muslim has come to an answer on this material that we're going to introduce now, especially on Mecca. So let's look, and I'm going to give you their conclusion before then I prove how they came to these conclusions. This is what they're finding. The first Arab inscription referencing Muhammad is not introduced till 691. Did you hear that? We know nothing about this man, Muhammad, from within Arab sources. Externally, we know about him. We have the Doctrina ai Jacobi in the British Library, 634. We also have the writings of Sabaeus in 660. But we don't have any Arab reference to his name until 691. That's curious. That means for 60 years, the Arabs didn't know this man. The first reference to the name Muslim is not introduced until the 690s. So what did these Arabs call themselves? Well, they call themselves Saracens. They call themselves Haggarines from the line of Hagar. They call themselves Ishmaelites from the line of Ishmael. They call themselves Maghrites from the area of the Maghreb. They call themselves Mahajurun, which would people of the Hijr, people of the Exodus. These are the nomadic people. So they did give their names, but they didn't use the word Muslim. Isn't that curious? The first reference to the religion called Islam is not till 691, and that's on the Dome of the Rock. The first reference to Mecca, here's the worst part. The first reference we can find to the city of Mecca is not till 741. And the first biography of Muhammad does not get written down till 833. Now, let's unpack that. That's an awful lot to take in just a few minutes. Let's start with geography, and let's look at what Dan Gibson was noting. He noticed when he looked through the Quran that there are about 65 geographical locations in the Quran. And over again, this prophet, though it doesn't give him a name, over and over again, it refers to the representative of God, the prophet of God. Over and over again, only 4 times in the Quran will you find Muhammad's name. This prophet, it says, always has this contact, and had over and over again, has contact with people from 3 different tribes. 23 times he has contact with people from Uz. 24 times he has contact with people from the Thamud, which would be the Nabateans. I'm sorry, did I say Uz? I meant Ud. So you have 23 times contact with people from Ud, which is the biblical Uz. 24 times the people from Thamud, which would be the Nabateans. And 7 times these people from Midian, which would be the Midianites. Over and over again, yet here's the curiosity. Take a look and see where the Ud, Thamud, and Midian are. They're way up here. Here's Mecca, way down here. That's 600 miles between them. How could he have daily contact with these people who live 600 miles further north? Unless, of course, he was flying in a jet back and forth every day. You can see the problem immediately. And that's the first thing that he came across. He said, this cannot be. You cannot have this much contact with people from so far away. When you look at the Quranic geographical locations, you will find there are 65 geographical locations in the Quran. We have 110 geographical locations in the book of Luke. 9 places are named in the Quran, 31 places are named in the book of Luke. 600 miles too far north, whereas every one in the Gospel of Luke are correct. But let's unpack it a little bit more. Let's look at Mecca. And this is, I think, is where the most problematic area is. I have yet to find a Muslim that can explain this next part that I'm going to share with you. And we've been bringing it down to Speaker's Corner. We've been introducing it in many of our debates. Muslims will not touch Mecca. You'll see why. Now, what we do know about Mecca, well, we only have one reference to it in the Quran. That's in Surah 48, Ayah 24. Other than that, it's just called the place of the Prophet, or the area of the Prophet. There's no reference other than 48, verse 24. We do know, according to the traditions, that's the tafsir, in the tahqiq, in the hadith, in the sirah, that it's in a valley and that it has a parallel valley, that it has a stream going right through it, that it has a pillar of salt. This prophet, as he goes out in the day, he passes by the pillar of salt, which is referring to Lot's wife, in the morning, and then comes back past that same pillar of salt in the evening. So it must be right outside of Mecca. According to the traditions, this Mecca has fields, it has clay, it has grass, it has trees, it has olive trees. That's curious. Olive trees. And that it has mountains overlooking the Kaaba. The problem is, none of you have been to Mecca, you're not permitted, but if you've seen pictures, and anybody that has been to Mecca, you know it's not in a valley. You know that there is not a parallel valley. There are no mountains overlooking the Kaaba. The closest mountains are about 5 kilometers away. There is no clay, grass, or loam. There has never been any clay, grass, or loam. And there certainly are no olive trees in Mecca, because there are no olive trees in all of Arabia. The only olive trees that grow up in the Mediterranean world, which is 600 miles further north. There you go again, 600 miles further north. It has no stream going through it. It has no water. It only has one well called the Zamzam well, and that's one of the reasons why Patricia Corona picked up and went on from there. But let's just deal with that later. We'll come back to that. Mecca, we do know, is at the center of Islam. It is absolutely important that Mecca should exist, because what we do know is that possibly it was the first place that Adam and Eve were sent to. Remember, Adam and Eve, according to Surah 7, were up in the Garden of Eden, which is up in space. It was not on earth. And in verse 24, when they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, they were thrown down, according to the traditions, down to Mecca, which would make it the oldest inhabitant in the history of mankind. According to Surah 21, Abraham was in Mecca. He goes into the Kaaba and destroys the idol. So certainly in 1900 BC, I had no idea Abraham was in Mecca, but according to the Quran, he was. That would mean Mecca would be at least as old as 1900 BC. We know from the traditions that Muhammad was not only a trader, but Mecca was the center of trade, north, south, east, and west. And that's why it enriched itself. That's why it got its importance. We know that Muhammad was born there. Supposedly, he then moved from there in 622. And that it became the center of the Qibla in 624. After 2 years of there, when the Qibla was moved back up to Jerusalem, it was then returned back down to Mecca, according to Surah 2, Ayah 143 to 150. Yet there's only one reference to it, and that's in Surah 48, Ayah 24. Now take a look at this map. What's wrong? What's missing? This is a Byzantine map of the trade routes in green. Where's Mecca on this map? Here's a 7th century Arab trade route map. Do you see what else is missing? It should be right where the question mark is. Here's a 6th century map. Mecca doesn't exist on this map. Here's a 7th century map. Mecca still doesn't exist. Looks like it's still missing on another 7th century map. And yet another 7th century map. Mecca is just non-existent on any map. We can't find it on any map. In the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, up until the 7th century. Dr. Patricia Corona was curious about this, and she looked at this map here, which is a facsimile of what it would have looked like in the 7th century. And she noticed the trade route. Now, since you're over here, I'm going to be pointing over here, but if you want to come over here and see, this is the Arabian Sea, and here's where all the spices were coming from the western coast of India, and also over here in China. And they used to come across the Arabian Sea up into the Persian Gulf to get over to the Mediterranean world. Now, Dr. Montgomery Watt is the one that came up with the trade route theory that supported the notion that during the 5th and 6th century, the Sassanids over here were warring with the Byzantines over here. The Byzantines and the Sassanids, Persians and Christians, warred for about 200 years, which shut down the Persian Gulf. So the trade had to be redirected down to here, across the Arabian Sea, over to Aden. And then when they went up 1,250 miles, right up the west coast of Arabia, up starting in Aden in the south, going to Najran, Sana, up to Taif, up down to Mecca, up to Yathrib, to Khaybar, Tabuk, Khaybar, and then up to Gaza in the north. That's the trade route theory. Have you all heard about this theory? It certainly helps out the Meccans enormously, because that supports the notion, therefore, that Mecca would have been on the trade route and would control the trade all the way from the south up into the north, from Aden up to Gaza. No one's really disputed that until Patricia Corona looked a little more carefully at the map. I don't know if you can tell, but if you look at the map carefully, you will notice when it comes up here to Taif, it then goes down, comes down, and has to then go back up to get to Yathrib. I'm shaking so much because it's so far away. Look at my PowerPoint when you get it, and you'll see it. It comes down from Taif, 1,000 meters down to get down to Mecca, then it has to go up 1,000 meters to get back up to Yathrib again. Why would there be any caravans? Why would they want to come off the plateau 1,000 feet, then go back up to get up to Yathrib when there's no water there to begin with? And it's not on any map. So where were they going? And where did this map come from? This map was not from the 7th century. This is from the 9th century and the 10th century, redacting it back to what they thought happened in the 7th century. So she decided to find out. Well, let's look and see if there was any trade through Mecca. Now, remember, this woman reads and writes 15 languages. So she went back and she went through all the trading documents, starting with the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. God bless her. She didn't bother to translate any of them for us. But what she did find is that there was no reference anywhere to a place called Mecca in any of the trading documents. In fact, the Arabs were not in charge of the trade. What she found was that the Africans here, the Andalusians, Andalus right there, was in all of the trading documents. And the reason is very clear. My 10-year-old son saw the reason. Let's see if you can find the reason. Anybody see what's wrong with the trade route theory? Take a hard look at the map and see what's wrong. Anybody want to venture a guess? Go ahead.
It's easier to go up water than across.
Good man, give him an A. Exactly. Why would you start on boats over here, come across the Arabian Sea, take off all your goods here and go 1,250 miles by land when you have a waterway going right up the side, the Red Sea? Why didn't they keep them on board boats? Well, this is exactly what she found. All the trade was maritime. It's much cheaper to send goods by water than it is by land. If you take a ton of goods, she found, and send it just 50 miles by land, it's the same cost as 1,250 miles by sea. That's why even today, all of our goods, our cars, and all of our large vehicles, and anything that's sent from one country to another, it's sent by ship, because it's so much cheaper than sending anything by land. Why hadn't no one noticed this before? So she noticed it, and so she wrote a whole book about it, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, published in 1987. She was given a death threat because of that book. And so she had to move from Oxford to Cambridge University. And that's when I met her, when she was at Cambridge. And then she noticed that she couldn't find any reference to Mecca. So she scoured all the trading documents. She went and she found documents from way up here in Ctesiphon, which is now Baghdad. They had come down over here to Yathrib, and they found silver outside of Yathrib, which is now today called Medina. The archaic name was Yathrib. And she looked at their documents, and they're just northeast of Mecca, but there's no reference to Mecca in any of their documents. They didn't know about this place. That's rather curious. If it's the center of the world, if it's the oldest city in history, if it's where Abraham lived, it's where Muhammad was living, it's where Islam began, no one heard about this city. The first reference she could find for Mecca was not to the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, Continuata Byzantia Arabica, written in 741. Muhammad died in 632. Can you see the problem? The first time it's recorded on any map is not till 900 AD. That's the 10th century. We don't see anything recorded on any map of this place called Mecca. Well, take a look at modern Mecca today. There's the 4th highest building in the world that they have now built in Mecca, the largest clock tower modeled on Big Ben itself over down here, and they are now building all around it. This looks down right onto the Kaaba, and all around it now, they are building what they want to do for the future. And one of those is going to be chosen as the future of Mecca. They are cementing the entire city up. Today, they're expanding, and you can see there's the clock tower. It's 45 feet across, that clock tower. It's going to be, they want to make it Meccan Mean Time. They want to take Greenwich Mean Time and change it to Meccan Mean Time, so all our clocks are going to be designated to that clock. But all around the Kaaba there are now all these cranes. You see that? They're all digging it all up. That's Muhammad's house right there. There's Khadija's house. They're cementing it all over. But here's the curious thing. Whenever you go back to an archaeological site, it doesn't matter where it is in the world, whether it's in Jerusalem or Damascus or Mecca, you always have archaeologists go with you so that if there's any ruins there, if there are any artifacts there, they take them, they preserve them, and put them into museums so that we can look at them, right? That is by law, done all over the world. In this case, that has been done as well. But guess what? They haven't found a thing to preserve. They've not found one thing to preserve, yet they're digging down hundreds of feet. They can't find anything there. Can you now see why they're cementing it up? No wonder they're cementing it up. I would too if I were in their place. It looks like Mecca has no history. And yet it should have the oldest history of all cities in mankind. Nothing has been found. If you don't have Mecca, the third problem is, what are you going to do with the Qibla? The Qibla is the direction of prayer. Every Muslim has to pray towards the Kaaba. And they have all kinds of machinations to help you to know where to pray. That's my hotel room. There's a little arrow that was on my hotel room in Kuala Lumpur, so I knew exactly where Mecca was. In every mosque, they have a mihrab where you can know exactly where the direction of Mecca is. And as you come down here, you can even get it on your apps, on your smartphones. According to Surah 2, Ayah 143 to 150, the direction of the Qibla was then redirected back to Mecca in 624. So we're talking about 624, which means every mosque should be facing Mecca after 624, which means every mosque. There are no mosques prior to 624, right? Back in the last century, well, another 1905, two researchers, Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fehrbari, when they were digging around old mosques in what is today Iraq and also in Egypt, they came across the Wasit Mosque and the Kufa Mosque in Iraq and the Fustat Mosque in Egypt. And as they dug down to the original floor plans, they noticed that the Qibla for all three of these mosques were wrong. The two mosques in Iraq, the Wasit and the Kufa Mosque, were facing straight west. The one in Fustat was facing straight east. They should have been facing down here. This is the 1905, they noticed this. And they just said, this is a curiosity. They suggested that maybe these mosques were facing Jerusalem. They were off by 3 to 5 degrees. But that's understandable. They weren't really interested in that. They just wanted to look and see what they could find. We do know that we have documentary evidence from Jacob of Edessa in 705. He even admits in the 8th century that it is from all of this clear that it is not to the south of the Jews in the Maghreb here in the regions of Syria pray, but towards Jerusalem or the Kaaba. That's what he thought. He was wrong. Dan Gibson has the one that has gone and run with this question, and he has come up with this new documentary, which you can get. Go and get it. It only costs $15, called The Sacred City. You can get it online. Just pull it down onto your computer. And what I'm going to do now is introduce what he has now found, because he wanted to take this question a step further. He wanted to find out where these mosques were praying. So he looked at numerous mosques from around the world, starting with the Mosque of the Two Qiblas. You can see there's a picture of it in Medina. There's one Qibla going that direction, and this direction, and one Qibla going, if you look off to here, that's the older one going off that direction. The Mosque of the Two Qiblas supposedly was facing Mecca, but it was returned, it moved to Mecca later. What was the earlier Qibla? When they uncovered it, they were refurbishing the mosque in 1987, and as they dug down, they came across the original Qibla. And look what they found. The original Qibla was not facing Mecca, it was facing the opposite direction towards Petra in Jordan. The great mosque in Guangzhou in China, built in 630, which is Guangzhou, I've been told. Sorry, I got it wrong. Did I still say it correct? Anybody correct me? I got hammered by a Chinese the other day for saying it wrong. Guangzhou, Zhao. It's now Canton today. In 630, take a look, it's 12 degrees off. So where is it facing? Not Jerusalem, not Mecca, but Petra. Look at the date, 630. The Fustat Mosque outside of Egypt, the one we've been referring to, built in 641. The description of the original floor plan showed a Qibla to the east and then later turned towards the south. Dan Gibson found that Qibla towards the east was Petra. Therefore, in 700 AD, it was still facing Petra. The great mosque of Baalbek in Lebanon, the Qibla in 701. Look at the date, 701. Muhammad died in 632. The Qibla was canonized in 624. Are you following me what I'm saying here? We're talking about 85 years later, it was facing Petra, not Mecca. Baalbek in Lebanon, the Qibla runs right through Petra. When we go to Jordan, the Amman Citadel in Jordan. Now this is interesting. Take a look at this one, because if you look carefully, you'll see two mosques. You'll see a bottom one here, that's built in 701. Then you'll see another mosque built up here later, built in 740. You notice there are two different Qiblas? That one there, the 701 mosque, is facing Petra. The one behind it and up above it, built in 740, is facing Mecca. Something happens between 701 and 740. Let's go and find out. The great mosque of Sana'a in the capital city of Yemen in 705, the Qibla, again, is facing Petra. We go to 706, the Kirbat al-Minya in Israel, built by Al-Walid, who is a son of Abdul Malik, on the shores of Galilee. Its Qibla is not towards Mecca, nor towards Jerusalem, but towards Petra. The Wasat Mosque that we talked about earlier from Iraq, built in 706. Archaeologists Krezel and Faravardi thought it pointed towards Jerusalem, but it doesn't. We now know that that mosque, the Qibla, is facing Petra. They were off by 3 degrees. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, now take a look at this one. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque that's right there in front of the Dome of the Rock. It's built in 706, built on a citadel. But when you look at the entire citadel, both of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is here, and the Dome of the Rock, which is up there, when you look at the two of them, you will see that the entire citadel is facing one uniform direction. So both the Dome of the Rock, which is built in 691, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is built in 706, both of them are, in fact, all of the citadel is facing Petra. And it's still facing Petra today. It hasn't changed. The Damascus Mosque in 709, the Qibla is facing Petra. Now we're up in Syria. Staying in Syria, the Mosque of Umar in 720, we're almost 100 years later, and the Qibla is facing Petra. The Kirbat al-Masjar Mosque in the West Bank, we're now in Palestine. 724, we're now almost 100 years later, and the Qibla is not towards Mecca nor Jerusalem, it's facing Petra. The Anjar Mosque in Lebanon, 724. This is a good one because this one was abandoned, so therefore it's preserved well. It's still pretty much the way when it was abandoned. And when you look at the Qibla there, you will find that the Qibla is facing directly towards Petra, there in Lebanon. Notice how up to 725, all of the Qiblas are facing Petra, and uniformly facing Petra. Muslims have tried to come back to me and say, well, they just didn't know their direction. They were not sure of the fact because it was all desert area. I said, these are people that did not have roads. They had camels. And when you're on camels in the middle of the desert, you better follow the stars. You better know your direction, otherwise you die. These people certainly knew their direction. What's more, why is it that uniformly every one of them is facing Petra? Uniformly, they're facing Petra. There you can see a backed up view as what we're talking about. Now, interestingly, when we get to 728, the Qiblas neither face Petra nor Mecca. That's a curiosity. And then finally, we get the first mosque that we have been able to find that's facing Mecca, and it's not till 731. And it's as far away as in Banbor in Pakistan. Pakistan, Zindahad. When you go back and you look there, you will see that it is Pakistan that finally gets it right. But the Mushta Mosque is an Umayyad mosque. That's interesting, because it was built in 743. Another 20 years later, and it's back to facing in Petra again. When you get to North Africa, there seems to be a real confusion. Here's the Ribat Fortress in Susa in Tunisia, built in 771. It's not facing either Petra or Mecca. It's facing straight south. The Cordoba Mosque in Spain, it's not facing Petra or Mecca. It's facing straight south. Again, much like the one in Kirawan that you have in Tunisia. Look at the date, 817. The Qiblas were canonized in 624. We're almost 200 years later, and it's still not facing Mecca. So, his conclusion, all the Qiblas were facing towards Petra until 725. There was a confusion for the next 100 years, and then the Qibla was not finalized towards Mecca until 822. That's 200 years too late. It takes them 200 years to finally canonize the Qibla towards Mecca. So, what's the significance of Petra? Well, take a look at that trade route map that I showed you earlier. What's at the center of all the trade? Petra is at the center of all the trade. What also is significance of Petra? It was the sanctuary of the Umayyads. The Umayyads used Petra as their sanctuary. Remember, they came into power in 661, and they were in power until 749. So, roughly 80 to 90 years they were in power. Those of you who have been to Petra, you will notice it is the center, is a city of tombs and temples. It is the center of the Nabatean kingdom. The Nabateans are the one that give us Arabic. Arabic comes from the Nabatean script. The Nabateans were there in Petra was as their sanctuary, and that was their sanctuary from the 2nd century BC. They were one of the great powers in the early years. And when you look at Petra, you will notice that it's in a valley, exactly like the Quran says. It has a parallel valley, just like the traditions say. It has a stream going through it. It has fields, trees, grass. It has clay. It has loam. It has olive trees. It's near that pillar of salt. If there was a pillar of salt, it would be near Petra. Petra has all the items listed in the Quran and also the Islamic traditions. Thus, could Petra be the place they are referring to? When you take a look at where Ad, Thamud, and Midian are, they're all around Petra, not Mecca. They're 600 miles further north. Significance of what we're saying? Nothing is known of Muhammad until the late 7th century from within Arab sources. His biography, the Sirah, the sayings, the Hadith, don't appear to the 9th century. His city isn't referred to until the mid-8th century. Thus, much of what we know of Muhammad is written down hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. It looks like nothing more than a redaction by Abdul Malik. So, what are the conclusions by the historians? Islam and the Prophet's life as we know it was not derived from the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years and then redacted back on the Prophet's life and compiled in the 9th century. Now, that's what they're saying. New books and documentaries are being published and question the classical account of Islam's beginning. And the questions are these: why are there no Muslim sources for 200 years? That's the billion-dollar question. Why do the claims they make not fit the historical record? Why are the geographical references so few and confusing? Why do they all seem to be much further north, 600 miles further north? Why are there so many references to vegetation which would not have existed in Mecca? Why is Mecca not even mentioned until 741, nor included on any map until 900? Why is Mecca not on the trade route? Why are all the Qiblas facing Petra for the first 100 years? Then there's a confusion for the next 100 years, and they're not standardized to Mecca until 822, 200 years too late. Therefore, much of what we know about early Islam is now in doubt. So, what really happened? Now, this is the scenario that we're looking at right now. This may change in 10 years. It may change even in 1 year. Because so much new material is being found that we're always having to upgrade it. This is what we think so far. To make sense of all what's going on, we need to begin with Abdullah ibn Zubair. Abdullah ibn Zubair was the one that rebelled against the Umayyads. He didn't see them as legitimate rulers. He was the governor of Petra himself. When he rebelled in 683, during the beginning of the Marwanid period of what we know as the Umayyad Caliphate. You have the Sufyanis from 661 up until 680, then Marwan the first takes over power, and then 683, Zubair rebels against him. He's there in Petra, and this is the beginning of what we know as the Second Civil War. Now, what's curious and what's interesting is the Umayyads are not down in Medina, they're not down in Mecca, they're not in Jerusalem, they're not in Petra, they're way up in Damascus. What are they doing way up in Damascus? Why has no one questioned this? That's even another 450, 500 miles even further north. So if this is the center of Islam, why is it so far away? In fact, you're talking about almost 1,000 miles away from Mecca. It's obvious that people haven't asked these questions because these are damaging questions. And that's why we're asking them now. And you can then understand why Zubair, when he then rebels against the Umayyads, he's got to leave Petra. So what does he do? He destroys the Kaaba, and then he takes the black stone, which is in Petra. There is documentation that it's been there for many years. Wherever the black stone is where God's presence is. He takes the black stone, leaves Petra in 683, and flees down to the south. Where did he flee to? Looks like he fled to Mecca. The Abbasids, meanwhile, who are headquartered up in Kufa and in Baghdad, further to the east, they do not like the Umayyads. They have always had a problem with the Umayyads. They then come alongside Zubair. Zubair is then killed by the Umayyads, and so therefore, you have two different groups who now have two different Qiblas. One towards Mecca and the other towards Petra. Now, let's now go back to Abd al-Malik, because this is where it all comes and it gets fleshed out. Abd al-Malik is the Umayyad Caliph. He's already having problems with Zubair. He's killed Zubair, in fact. He's got to establish his ascendancy. So what does he do? In 691, he plants a huge building right in the middle of Jerusalem called the Dome of the Rock. You've seen it, those who've been to Jerusalem. It stands out. It's a beautiful building. You can see it from all over Jerusalem, with that beautiful golden dome. That's built in 691. He needs to create an identity. He needs to create his own Arab identity. Now remember, when the Arabs who then took over the Sassanid world and also the Byzantine world, which they had done by 642. They had run over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. They took over these 5 great cities of Levant. They were all nomadic. They were not urban people. That's why they did not live in those cities. They lived outside the cities in garrison towns. But someone had to run the cities. Well, who are they going to let run the cities? They're going to let their cousins from the Abrahamic race, the Jews and the Christians, who were well educated. They were already living in the cities. So they let them run the cities. They became what they call mawalas or mawalis. As long as they ran the cities, the Arabs then benefited from all the produce. They didn't have to run it themselves, and they could continue to conquer. And that's why they then moved right across North Africa, all the way to Spain, and moved the other direction to India. They were busy conquering, and they kept the Jews, primarily the Jews and the Christians, to run what they conquered. But the problem is this. The Jews and the Christian had a prophetic line. The Arabs don't have a prophetic line. The Jews and the Christians were the ones from which all the prophets came to. Therefore, they had a strong identity. Where was there an Arab prophet? So by the time, 40 years later, by the time Abd al-Malik comes to power, he is known as the great Arab reformer. We've known this about him. Everybody knows him as the great Arab reformer. He is the one that introduces Arabic as the international script. Now, up until that time, all the caliphs had used coins. They had coins that were like the dinar that you see here. Take a look at the dinar. That's the Byzantine dinar at the top. And when you notice, you'll see the emperor with 2 retainers on either side. On the back side of the dinar is the Byzantine cross. The Sufyanis, or the Umayyads, take the same coin because they still want to use the same type of coinage. And instead of using the emperor, they put themselves, the caliph, with 2 retainers. On the back side is the Byzantine cross with the crosspiece taken off. These are all from the British Museum. So they retain images of themselves. Since when is Islam allowed to have any images? That's anathema, is it not? When Abd al-Malik comes to power, he has a coin like this. That's a coin of himself with a large sword, and there's the Byzantine cross, or half the Byzantine cross. He then throws that out, and in 691 introduces these coins. He takes off the images and introduces script. And what do you think's on that script? The Shahada. This is the first time we see the Shahada. This is the first time anywhere that the Shahada is introduced, in 691. Are you getting me? Are you following me? That's not all he does. He then builds the greatest structure of its day, the Dome of the Rock, built there in Jerusalem. But take a look at where it's built. It's not just built anywhere. Who controlled Jerusalem, and who's the great power that he's up against? The Byzantines. He's up against the Byzantines. He doesn't care about the Sassanids because they are pretty much destroyed and they don't have a common ancestry. But he does have a common ancestry with the Byzantines because they have the prophetic line. So what are you going to do? You're going to build the greatest structure in the history of mankind, slap it right there in Jerusalem, but you're going to put it up on a hill above the Church of the Sepulchre, which is the centerpiece for the Byzantines. There you can see the Church of the Sepulchre across the valley and the Dome of the Rock. It's built above it to get one-upmanship. Are you getting that? And then he faces the Dome of the Rock towards Petra. Where's the sanctuary? So now you've got the biggest building, the best building, but to understand what's going on, you want something that's larger and more prominent than the Byzantines, the holiest city for the Jews and the Christians. Therefore, why not build this in Damascus? Because he's building it where the Byzantines have their holy place. And he says, we have the next holy place. And this is where, of course, if we now ask any Muslim today, what happens there? They say, this is where Muhammad went in the middle of the night on the back of the wing holes called the Miraj that I introduced earlier, and that's where he went up to the seven heavens. If that's the reason why the Dome of the Rock was built, then why is there nothing written about it? Look at all the ambulatories. Go look at all the inscriptions on the inner ambulatories. That's the only original part of the buildings that exist today. The building has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. If you look at the original ambulatories, you will notice that there are inscriptions up there. Take a look at those inscriptions. There's nothing at all written about the Miraj. So what's written on them? Well, notice what's written on them. O people of the Scripture, do not exaggerate in your religion, nor utter not concerning Allah save the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of Allah, and his word which he conveyed unto Mary, and a spirit from him. So believe in Allah and his messengers, and say not three. Cease. It is better for you. Allah is only one God. Far as it be removed from the transcendent majesty that he should have a son. Surah 4, Ayah 171. This is the first Quranic material we can find. The first Quranic material is introduced on the Dome of the Rock. That's Surah 4, Ayah 171. Who is it against? Jesus, the Trinity, his sonship. It's against us. Praise be to God, who hath not taken unto himself a son, that's against Jesus, and who hath no partner, that's against Jesus being the partner of God, Surah 17, Ayah 111, and then Surah 112, there is no God but God, there's the Shahada, there's the beginning of the Shahada, there is no God but God, he is one, he has no associates, that's against Jesus Christ, say he is God the one, God the eternal begotten, besought of all, he begetteth not nor was begotten, that's against Jesus Christ again, and there is none comparable unto him, Muhammad is the messenger of God, that's the first time Muhammad's name is introduced. That's the first place we find Muhammad's name. And it's introduced on the Dome of the Rock. And it's introduced on the coins the same year. Are you following what's going on? So they attack Jesus, and they introduce Muhammad. He then replaces Jesus on the Dome of the Rock. Now, at the same time, we have the protocols, the caliphal protocols. This is done by Yehuda Nevo. Yehuda Nevo noticed that all the protocols from the Sufyani period of the Umayyad Caliphate, from 661 all the way up until 680, up until 685, there is no Bismillah, there is no reference in any of these protocols. These are the official documents of the caliphs themselves. When you look at these official documents, there's no reference to Muhammad, there's no reference to Mecca, there's no reference to the Quran, and there's no reference to people called Muslims, and there's no reference to a religion called Islam. Those are the 5 things that these caliphal protocols should be replete with. They don't exist on any of the protocols until 691. In 691, Dr. Neville says, overnight they are introduced into the protocols. It's done overnight, and Muhammad's name is introduced at that time. The Shahada is introduced at that time. So here you have it being introduced on a building, on coins, and on the caliphal protocols, all in 691. He replaces all the images and replaces it with Arabic script. So once he introduces Muhammad, he then needs a revelation, because every prophet has to have a revelation. That's why now, and we're going to do work on this more tomorrow, so I'm not going to unpack it much today. When you look at the earliest manuscripts, they only begin to get introduced at this period. The earliest material that we have on the palimpsest that I'll introduce tomorrow are from the time of Abdul Malik. But then they get changed by the time his son comes around in 705. The earliest Quranic manuscripts begin to appear during the reign of his son Al-Walid from 690s to 750s. None of these manuscripts that we're going to see tomorrow are complete, nor do they even parallel each other, nor do they parallel the Quran that we have today. They continue to be changed and corrected for 200 years. Therefore, the sanctuary in Petra is destroyed by an earthquake in 713. Once the earthquake comes and destroys Petra, that means God's presence is no longer there. So the Umayyads have no other choice but then to move the sanctuary down to Mecca. That's why then from that time on, they decide, and this is where the rivalry goes on. When are they going to actually move it up to Mecca, down to Mecca, and that's where the rivalry begins. And that's why the Abbasids start coming to the fore. And it's the Abbasids then that start changing the Qiblas starting in 731. So, here you go. Now that the Muslims have a prophet, who now has a revelation, who now has a sanctuary, Mecca, they need a history. So what do? Can you now understand why the Siddha takes so long to get written? Why it only is introduced, not in 765 by 765 by by Ishaq. Interestingly, we don't have Ibn Ishaq's material. It's all been destroyed. Which stands to reason, looks like they destroyed everything that did not agree with the canonized text. And that's why finally Ibn Hisham writes it down. But Ibn Hisham makes it very clear that he threw out anything that he disagreed with at Ibn Ishaq. And he finally finalizes it in 833. So it takes him to 833 to finally write down the story of this prophet that was introduced in 691. It takes them another 40 years to then introduce his sayings. Can you then understand why he was given 600,000 and he whittles them down only to 7,397? He throws out 98%. Can you understand why he had to do that? Because that's where the censoring comes in. And that's why it makes sense now that this does not happen over a 22-year period like Muslims would like to tell us. What's happened to my PowerPoint here? So they now have a history. The Siddha is introduced in 833. The Hadith is introduced in 870. And the Tafsir, then the commentaries on how to understand the Quran, is introduced in 923, the 10th century. By the 9th century, they now have a book, the man, the place, and the story. And a new religion is formed and growing, yet not within a mere 22 years, but evolving over 200 to 300 years. How am I doing on time? I'm just concluding here. New books are being published which question the classical account of Islam's beginning. The questions we're asking is, why are the no Muslim sources for 200 years? Why do the claims they make not fit the historical record? Why are the geographical references so few and confusing? Why do they all seem to be much further north? Why are there so many references to vegetation which wouldn't exist in Mecca? Why is Mecca not mentioned until 741 and not included any map until 900? Why is Mecca not even on the international trade route? Why do all the Qiblas face Petra for the first 100 years, then are confused for the next 100, and aren't standardized to Mecca until 822, that's 200 years too late? Why is Abdul Malik's role what is Abdul Malik's role in all of this? Does a nascent Islam really begin with him? Since much of what we know about early Islam is in doubt, since much of the Quran is also in doubt, since nothing is known to Muhammad until the 7th century, or Mecca until the 8th century, or his story until the 9th century, hundreds of years and hundreds of miles away, can we conclude that Islam is nothing more than a later redaction, possibly, I would say, begun by Abdul Malik, but I want to change that. I would also say that there is a political competition going on between the Umayyads and the Abbasids. And that's why Petra was finally discarded and Mecca was then included. But by that time, the Quran had already been written. That's why they couldn't excise all these geographical locations. That's why they couldn't take out all these references to Ad, Thamud, and Midian. They weren't able to do that. Can you see why? They should have done that in the 7th century before they even started writing the Quran. Too late. We've caught them hanging. And that's why it's so difficult to support Mecca. Can you now understand? They have the wrong man at the wrong place doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Now what about Jesus? We know where Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We know where Jesus grew up in Nazareth. We know where Jesus died and went in Jerusalem. We know what Jesus did for the last 3 years. We know that from the eyewitness accounts, according to Matthew and John. We know from hostile accounts, Thales, Tacitus, Josephus. We know when they were written down between 50 to 60 years. Few people doubt his historicity. Thus, we have the right man at the right place doing the right thing at the right time. Ooh, I love Jesus. And can you see why I love the Bible? Can you imagine if we had the problems that Islam has? How would we even debate what he did and what he said? With this kind of material now coming to the fore, and this has just been out just 1 month. Can you see, from here on out, we're just going to be asking these same questions. And that's why I love history, because the more they scratch, the more they find. The more they find, the more we shine. The more we shine, the more they whine, oh, how sublime. Thank God we don't have this problem. See, everything that I've said today, all this material that we're now using against Mecca and against the Qibla and looking at all the problems between the Umayyads and the Abbasids, have you noticed this has all been foisted against Christianity? We've had it since the 1800s, and we had the documentary hypothesis. We had enormous amount of criticisms, of redacted criticism, source criticism. We've had all kinds of criticism against the Trinity and the person of Jesus Christ. We've had it for about 150 years, and we've answered every one of them. One of the best men I know, Sam Shamoun, can answer everything about Jesus Christ. But then we have not taken these questions to Islam. We are just now starting to focus these kind of questions, redacted criticism. What have I done today? I've just been doing source criticism, redacted criticism. I've been doing historical criticism, a little bit of literary criticism. It's not very difficult to do what we're doing here. Every one of you can do this. We're now doing it in London. This is all going up on YouTube. It's starting to really hurt the Muslims. They don't have an answer for it. See, when this was brought out in Tübingen there with Wellhausen back in the 1800s, it decimated the church by 1905. By 1905 in Europe, all the churches were destroyed, most of the churches, not all, because of Darwinianism and because of historical criticism. Now, we've learned to find all these material. That's why we have a great museum tour called the British Museum Tour in the British Library. If you come to London, we're going to take you on it. In 3 hours, we will show you artifact after artifact stolen by the British, put into that building so we could look at it, that shows you exactly how 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel can be historically proven. We have names, dates, places, and people all right there in front of you to show and support the book of Genesis, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Isaiah. It's so good to be able to say that, because we've done our homework. Where are the Muslims going to go to find these kind of objects? Where are the artifacts to support Mecca, when they can't even find any ruins below those skyscrapers? Those skyscrapers are digging up nothing but sand. And that's exactly what Islam is built on. Nothing but sand. Thank God we're built on a rock. And that's why the rocks, if we don't cry, the rocks are going to cry out for us. And that's why we just need to fall back in the safety of our Lord Jesus Christ and know that He is putting the rocks in place and putting the tablets and the murals and the stelas so we can support what we know. And that's why I love my Bible. And that's why I love Jesus Christ. Good. Any questions you may have? Yeah. Is this being recorded, by the way? Is this being recorded? It's being filmed? Do you want me? Okay, he will use the microphone.
Thank you for the information. It was great, and appreciate you sharing that with us, and look forward to being able to use that. I did one question, though, was you mentioned the mosques that were built in 632 and various stages. What's the history behind those? What were they being built for? If Muhammad and the Quran hadn't come into place yet, the sort of the history behind all that, why were these mosques popping up? Okay, good question. The question is, what are you going to do with Guangzhou, a mosque in 630? What are you going to do with the Medina, the two Qibla mosque, which is 624? What are you going to do with these mosques so early? Is what you're getting at. Remember, what was Petra before the Muslims took over it? It was the Nabatean sanctuary. So these would all be Nabatean temples that had been taken over by the Muslims, who then made them into their own mosques. A mosque means a place where you bow down. That's what a mosque is. It's a masjid. It's a place to bow down. And therefore, it was created by these early ones. The ones before the Muslims took them over would have been temples to the Nabatean gods. And what's interesting, take a look at the Nabatean gods. Who is the primary Nabatean god? His name is Allah. That's a Nabatean god. Isn't that interesting? Allah has a wife, Alat, which is the feminine form of Allah. The other name for Alat is Aluza. Have you heard that name? Alat, Aluza, and Al-Manat. Take a look at the Quran, Surah 53, Ayah 19 and 20. These are the satanic verses. These are the three goddesses that are mentioned in the Quran itself. These are Nabatean goddesses. Now, I read in my Quran, in Surah 6, Ayah 101, that God cannot have a consort. Then what's He doing with Alat, His consort? Ooh, I love this. Makes my job a lot easier.
which means this Allah, this supposed Nabatean God from which all these people are praying to, is a borrowed God, but they got the wrong God. They should have never used Allah, because Allah is not only a pagan God, he is a polytheistic God. He has a wife named Allat and Al-Uzza, which proves to me he cannot be the God we're looking for. Therefore, what and who is Muhammad? And what you've noticed today, we're not only confronting the God of Islam, Allah, we're also confronting the man of the Islam, Muhammad. Because after everything you've heard today and what you're going to hear tomorrow, those who were at the debate yesterday, the ones who were here yesterday, did you hear what we did with the manuscripts? We've pretty well destroyed any notion that the Quran existed before the 8th century. And if the Quran it doesn't exist until the 8th century, then who in the world is Muhammad? And what's his purpose? And in one fell swoop, we're destroying Allah, Muhammad, and the Quran all at once. And without Allah, Muhammad, and the Quran, what is Islam? Ooh, I love it. And that's why these are good questions, but remember, it all fits to the historical record. And that's why the documentary evidence fits the archaeological evidence. Tomorrow we're going to see it also fits the manuscript evidence. It's all fitting to one piece. And that's why I would say these mosques were temples, which then became mosques, but they're all facing Petra, the Nabatean kingdom, where Allah comes from.
Didn't they find some Qurans that were actually too early?
Okay, the question is, did they find some Qurans that were actually too early? And this is called and we can talk more about it tomorrow, but this is what the folios, the Birmingham folios. The date on those folios, there's just 2 pages. They actually come from the Petropolitanus manuscript, which is in Paris, in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Those 2 folios were dated from 568 to 645. So it's a 77-year period because it's carbon dating, which is very inexact. If it's 568 to 645, you've got a real problem. Because when this was ballyhooed last July all over the internet, they didn't stop to think what they were saying. And many Muslims did not say anything. Did you notice? A lot of Muslims were quiet. Because how can you have 2 folios of a manuscript from Surah 18, 19, and 20 that are from 2 years before Muhammad was even born, and then existed 7 years before the Quran was even written? Ooh, You've got a problem. But that's not the only carbon datings that they've done. They're now dating also the Sana manuscript. And the dates they're getting that are 443 to 543. That's the 5th and 6th century. That's long before Muhammad was born, long before Islam began, and certainly long before the Quran was written. Ooh, I love this. So it looks like these are pre-Islamic, pre-Quranic texts. They are Quranic in that they are very similar to what we have in the Quran. But look at the stories that they include. Surah 18, 19, and 20 include the story of Dhul Qarnayn, who is Alexander the Great. They include also the 7 sleepers, and they also include the story of Moses, which does come from the Bible, but not the same stories we have in the Bible. These are apocryphal writings. These are sectarian writings. These we know well of because the Quran is full of them. And it's these writings that you find in these folios. Now, let me just say, however, be careful of carbon dating. I have a feeling that most of these dates are wrong because they're all over the place. The fact that they're so early and that they are not consistent. I would suggest that as more time is being put into them, they're probably going to find that these carbon datings are not correct. Therefore, I would go with the paleographical and the codicological discoveries. Those are much more exact. We'll talk more about those tomorrow because the paleographical studies that are being done on the Quran are much more exact. And that's why we're going to go with those dates. Nonetheless, either way, Muslims have it wrong because this means the Quran existed long before Muhammad. Muhammad had nothing to do with it. And the paleographical studies say the Quran existed long after Muhammad. Muhammad had nothing to do with it. So either way, Muhammad had nothing to do with it. We got him coming and going. Any other questions? Last question? Yeah, we do need to get to the next person. Those who have questions, just see me. If you want this PowerPoint, come get it from me and talk to me later and we'll give it to you.
Jay, there are many people that question, such as Tori, about why the name Islam was chosen. And in Arab poetry, as well as the earliest copies of translations of the gospel, the word Islam and the verb are used to mean to betray, to deliver over, to hand over. And the verb form itself is used repeatedly for what Judas Iscariot did to Jesus. And the stuff that you presented about the Dome on the Rock fits in very well with this idea that the word Islam means betrayal as opposed to submission.
Good man. Wow, I've not heard that before. Who are you? Yes, Adam, that's a very good, did you all catch that? So it is betrayal, the root, every Arabic word has three-letter root, the consonantal root. And so you're saying that is betrayal. It's not submission or subservience. It is betrayal, which is what we seem to be finding with the Dome of the Rock. We'll go with that. We'll see how much we can come with it, and we'll ask certainly the other scholars and see if that works. Thanks a lot, Adam, for that. God bless you, people. If you want to see me more, come and see me, and we'll give you the PowerPoint so you can have it.